Welcome back, ETHDenver. As a reminder, this is Try and Stage, and we've got a lot of couple great talks left today. Right now, I got a really great talk coming from Saar Cavanaugh, who's going to be chatting about how we can build on-chain organizations. And so let's give a little round of applause for Spencer and let him take it from here.
All right. Hi, everyone. Testing. OK. Yeah, I'm Saar Cavanaugh, also known as Clinamenic here. I'm going to be talking about on-chain organizations. So over the course of this presentation, I want to give a brief explanation of what on-chain organizations can be understood as, how they differ from DAOs and draw from the DAO movement, some examples of smart contracts that can be used to build on-chain organizations, how they can be combined, and then ending with one example of a full-on org chart for an on-chain organization. Here we go. So I think a simple way of answering what an on-chain organization is any organization that uses smart contracts or has some other kind of on-chain presence. I think a parallel sort of term is a virtual organization, which has a couple different kind of confusing meanings, but it basically just means any organization that uses digital communication technology to work together. So it's not so much an entity type term, it's kind of a qualitative descriptor or some term that describes how an organization works. It's also sort of like an evolution of an online organization, just on-chain. And you can sort of think of this as a post-DAO framework, if that's helpful at all, in that it's not so much about decentralization as it is about the other redeeming values of smart contracts and operating on-chain. So how is it different from DAOs? If you think of DAOs as on-chain organizations that use this technology to enable decentralization in novel ways or enable collective agency in novel ways, then on-chain organizations are sort of just a generalization from that, and that they're not as much built around decentralization, but can be built around some other redeeming values of smart contracts. Because the technology itself isn't like particular to decentralized applications, although a lot of it was built with that intention. There are also plenty of smart contracts that you can use in a traditionally centralized way. You can have a safe multi-sig that just functions as a board of directors if that works for your organization, or you can tie it into a lot more decentralized framework if you want to have a more decentralized approach. But the idea is that this term on-chain organization and a few other terms that have been used, like internet native company, can use this technology but aren't as dedicated necessarily to decentralization as DAOs are. So this may ring true for some of you. Hopefully it's not too pessimistic, but it does encapsulate a lot of my experiences. And it does make me think of when decentralization is an imperative or when it's an ideal. Sometimes it involves a lot of friction and added difficulty and bureaucratic complexity because we think it's worth it to embody those ideals. But sometimes we just learn that decentralization isn't necessary for a given activity or a given operation, or maybe an organization doesn't need to be totally decentralized to incorporate those values of democracy or equitability. And so the idea is that if you can be a bit more selective about where you use centralized and decentralized components, you can still have accountability and hopefully less dudes arguing online. And so here are some examples of what I think of as the other redeeming values of smart contracts. For nonprofits, the transparency can be important or sometimes required legally. Or again, if it's an ideal of an organization you're with, you may just want to embody the value of transparency. Interoperability is another one that's a bit more of a network effect promise. If you want to envision a future wherein a lot of institutions and organizations operate on-chain, then it may be in your organization's interest to be interoperable with whatever that technological status quo is, whatever that may look like for your industry. But that one's still a bit like prospective. Like right now, we aren't at a status quo where it's the norm for organizations to have an on-chain presence. So the interoperability, like value prop, I don't think has quite materialized yet, but it could be. But I think one of the big ones that, at least as far as I can discern right now, is currently valuable is autonomy, largely from siloed or proprietary software platforms that certain organizations may use now for hosting content or facilitating payroll or whatever other kind of storage or operations, where if you are operationally dependent on some other proprietary company or platform, you're sort of also depending on that company to stay in business. And if they go out of business, that part of your stack or your infrastructure goes out of business too, and kind of takes out a chunk of the integrity of your organization. So the idea with smart contracts, at least as I understand them, is that you can interact with this stuff through interfaces that are maintained by companies, but a lot of the underlying infrastructure is a bit more capture resistant, is the term that the folks at HATS protocol would use, and that it's difficult for this stuff to, or at least it can be more difficult for this stuff to be captured or to be deprecated in ways that I gather is much more frequent in the existing status quo virtual organizations. So I think these are some redeeming values of smart contracts beyond any kind of decentralization they may enable. And here are some examples of smart contracts in particular. I just mentioned HATS for role management. DAO House is a platform for interacting with Moloch contracts, so you can build a membership body on chain and enable that kind of collective agency. Grant Stack is for if you want to run a centralized or decentralized grants program, whether that's quadratic funding or direct funding, you can do that on chain now. And Safe, just joint accounts, they can also function as committees. Very easy to start plugging these things together, and that's what I hope to convey in the next couple slides as well. Yeah, we're all kind of familiar with the Lego block, kind of organizational building block things. So that's what I'm hoping to convey with a few of these diagrams like this. Now I've got a QR code at the end of this if anyone's interested in checking out the slideshow and seeing some of these details that are probably too small to read right here. And I've also got a link to this article that explains some of this, but this is one example of tying together HATS protocol, a Moloch framework, and Safe to essentially allow a group of people to redelegate someone who's on their board of directors or some other kind of representative committee using a few steps. Granted, it's still pretty complicated, but the fact that something like this is feasible is still pretty amazing to me. And I think a lot of work is being done to make using this technology a lot easier and to make the prospects of actually letting more people than just nerds and developers interact with this stuff a bit more likely. I find that very reassuring. And again, I've got this article explaining this particular dynamic right here. And this article right here, again, for anyone who wants to look at it, is intended to try to bring the reader from zero to understanding on-chain organization design, again, beyond just DAOs in particular. And this is another really big one that, again, details are far too small to see, but the idea is you can start composing these things to build full-on organizational charts and kind of, or black prints or architectures, combining all these things. So you can have, is my cursor up there? Yeah. You can have a committee, essentially, or a community of token holders, in this case represented by a Moloch contract, effectively operating as a large board of directors functionally. Again, from a legal capacity, you may want to look at particular circumstances. This may not be advisable for what you're trying to do, but from a technical perspective, this is possible. You can have an arbitrary number of members in a Moloch contract essentially overseeing who is on their executive committee or something like a C-suite, using Safe. Every one of these committees, these little big orange dots, is a Safe contract, and all of the signers for those contracts are wearing hats that are bound to those safes in what the HATS team calls a signer gate multisig, where instead of having individual users or accounts be signers on a multisig in a more fixed way, they're dynamically bound to hats, and thus whoever's wearing those designated hats has signer access to a multi-sig, and that's what can, like, when you contextualize that within this whole kind of on-chain hierarchy, you can have a lot more accountability than just what was the status quo for a lot of early DAOs, which is just a bunch of people voting on a multi-sig. I mean, a bunch of people voting on a snapshot, and then a multi-sig of 3 to 5 people choosing whether or not to go with the verdict. So this kind of ties it all together and lets you have hierarchy and certain degrees of decentralization in a way where there's still accountability. A community of people can still track what's going on and can still exert some kind of agency, but whether it's just switching the hat of someone that has proven to be a bad actor and has violated some kind of internal policy or code of conduct, they can switch the hat to someone else that went through some other kind of designated election process, or they can add someone else, or they can switch it so that there is a more centralized board of directors away from the DAO as well. And this top 3 right here is one example of, all right, I've got enough time. One example of this risk of code is law, or code's law, where if you depend on this stuff for an organization to run in a compliant fashion, you may run into certain edge cases where there isn't any human who's able to step in some sort of state of emergency or failure case, and then that may have nasty implications in terms of people's liability. And so one potential way to address this, and this hasn't been implemented to my knowledge, but I'm sure there's analogs in traditional organization design, is these 3 top ones right here, or what I'm calling the fail-safe committee, is you can have a DAO, essentially, or whatever you want to call a wide body of token holders or members of a Moloch contract. This may work with governor contracts as well, but I haven't tried that. You can have this community or this DAO essentially be the board of directors or the main supervisors of an organization, and they manage this C-suite down here. And the C-suite is the one that's operationally in charge. They handle a lot of the budget, but they're still accountable to this DAO essentially up here. And a lot of this kind of needs to be glued together by operating agreements and other kind of internal policies that get more into social consensus and legalese. But that plus this kind of infrastructure, I think, can reconcile a lot of the trade-offs between operational efficiency and accountability and prevention of corruption and accessibility and democracy and a lot of the stuff that I think has been driving the DAO movement. So the idea is that the DAO or the community of token holders or members can oversee this C-suite and essentially be in control of the C-suite. But if something is compromised technologically, or if there's some other kind of edge case or takeover, a whale attack or something that people de facto realize as a failure case, then there can be provisions in some operating agreement that designates this fail-safe committee to override the DAO or switch it to an updated DAO contract. But this sign-aggregate committee, which could be the same people in the executive, or it could be some other kind of auxiliary board that doesn't do anything unless a state of emergency is entered into. That could be one way of preserving that kind of emergency human agency in some kind of technological failure case, but just confined to well-defined failure cases within some operating agreement or some other internal policy. So that's just one example of how you can use all these building blocks to build a whole on-chain architecture for an organization and start trying to address some of these operational difficulties with trying to enable decentralization to be a bit more effective and to enable more accountability, but not at the cost of hindering like the operational efficiency or the dexterity or the ability to execute of an organization. But again, this is theoretical. I haven't seen this implemented. Maybe, again, there's something analogous in a DAO or in some traditional organization. But yeah, that's the presentation. I'm glad we did manage to get through it, and hopefully there's time for questions. Yeah. Is there time for questions? good? Cool. Thank you.